everybody, it's Aisha again, and welcome back to Digital ELA LOT. Before we get into today's lesson, I just wanted to say thank you guys for coming back, and thank you for taking time out of your busy weeks to do some lessons with us. I know that school hasn't started, I'm sure you guys have other things to do, and I just think it's really great that you're taking the time to do this. Okay, so this week is going to be a lot like last week in that there are two lessons. I'm going to be doing the first one, which is this video, where I'm going to read a nonfiction passage called An Early Warning, and we're going to be taking some notes and stuff. As you watch it, I want you to have a notebook out and to take some notes. Once you're done, check the link in the description and try some of the questions that we have. And then once you finish those questions, watch the next video, which Alexa will do, and she's going to go over those questions. Okay, so have your notebook out and let's get into it. So this week, or today, I guess, we're going to be going over function questions. We went over function questions in the past, you guys might remember them, but in case you don't, function questions are just questions that ask you what the function, which is the role or purpose, a specific part of the passage plays. In other words, it's going to be asking you why the author included it. Some tips for function questions is try to get into the head of the author. We're really trying to figure out why they included a certain paragraph, sentence, word, detail. Sometimes it can be something as small as certain punctuation. Another tip is going to be keep track of main ideas of the passage and of each paragraph as you read, so you can figure out how each little thing relates back to it, because that's all a function question is. It's asking you how something relates back to the main idea or helps the author serve the purpose that they want to with this passage. So in order to do that, we're going to be taking notes as we read today. We're going to be doing something called annotating. So annotating is just a way of adding on to a text or a diagram. It's something that you'll probably do in high school. Maybe you guys have already done it. And it's a way of taking notes. So some tips for annotating are use your notes to keep track of big ideas and concepts. So don't go crazy. We're not like writing a whole summary. We're just taking little notes. Another tip is underline important words, ideas, or phrases. So you can't underline everything. If you do, when you look back at the text, it's going to look even more overwhelming than it did when you started. Instead, we're underlining words and phrases that we think are important to the text, but that we don't want to copy. Finally, like my last tip, is use abbreviations or symbols to make it easier. So I'm going to be doing that in the annotations that we do today together. But in general, annotating and taking notes, the only person that it really matters for is you. It doesn't matter if they're grammatically perfect sentences. It doesn't matter if they would make sense to anybody else. These are notes for you. Okay, so at any point, pause the video if you need to. We're going to go on to the next slide, and there's the first two paragraphs. I'm going to read them, and then we're going to annotate them together. Okay. One of the books that has done the most to alert the world to the dangers of environmental degradation is George Perkins Marsh's Man and Nature. Its message that Western society is in the process of causing irreparable harm to the environment greatly influenced ecologists during the beginning of the modern environmentalist movement in the 1960s. Marsh was not, however, part of this movement. Surprisingly, Man and Nature was first published in 1864. Marsh first observed the environmentally destructive effects of human activities while growing up in Vermont in the early 19th century. The heavy demand for firewood had depleted the forests, and extensive sheep grazing had stripped the land. The result was flooding and soil erosion. Furthermore, streams were fouled by waste dumped from numerous mills and dye houses. Okay, so we're going to start with the underlining. Remember, underlining is only for words and phrases that you think are important but that you don't want to copy down. So I underlined part of the first sentence of the first paragraph. I'm not sure if you guys remember this, but we always said that the first sentence of the first paragraph is usually pretty important in these texts because it gives you a pretty big hint as to what the whole passage is going to be about. And later, you should look back at it when you're coming up with your main idea. So I underlined, alert the world to dangers of environmental degradation, because that seems to be part of the main idea. And what does that is George Perkins Marsh's Man and Nature. Next, we're going to move on to notes. So I wrote more or less one note per paragraph. So the note I wrote for the first paragraph is GPM, which is an abbreviation I came up with for George Perkins Marsh. You can write it down if you want to. Remember, abbreviations and symbols and stuff, it only really matters for you. Oh, and just in case I forgot to mention it earlier, an abbreviation is a way of shortening a phrase by just writing the letters, so like LOL or whatever. Those are all abbreviations, but I use GPM. So my note says, GPM inspired environmentalist movement way before it happened. That is more or less the gist of the first paragraph. Again, not a perfect sentence, but it makes sense to me, and it probably makes sense to you. For the second paragraph, I wrote, GPM got interested in nature from growing up in Vermont where he saw environmental damage. Again, that pretty much sums it up. It would take me like 5 seconds to write. So we're going to move on. Pause and write down these notes. Okay, next two paragraphs. Much later in his life, after careers in law, business, farming, and politics, Marsh served as an ambassador to Italy. There he noticed land abuse similar to what he had seen in Vermont. Overgrazing and forest mismanagement had rendered areas that had been productive farmland since the days of the Roman Empire desolate. Marsh attributed this to what he called man's ignorant disregard for laws of nature. In Italy, Marsh began to organize his observations and theories. He wrote in a way intended to educate readers about the impact of industrial and agricultural practices on the environment. In Man and Nature, he evaluated the important relationships between animals and plants, discussed forestry practices in great detail, and analyzed the way natural water supplies are affected by human use. Okay, so again, we're starting with the underlining. So I underlined that phrase, man's ignorant disregard for nature, for the laws of nature. The reason I did this is because this phrase by itself, it made a good amount of sense to me, and I know it's important because it's one of Marsh's ideas. So far, we can tell that this passage is about Marsh, his ideas, and the impact they had. So things that connect back to that, I'm going to want to underline or write down. Now we're going to move on to the notes. I wrote for the first paragraph, GPM, again, that's Marsh, saw similar environmental damage in Italy, similar to the damage he saw in Vermont, which I mentioned before. For the next paragraph, my note says, GPM began to write about relationships between animals, plants, and human impact. Okay, so pause the video, copy those down if you need to. If you want to write down like a different version of that, that's perfectly fine. Just make sure you're getting the gist of the paragraph. That's all these notes really aim to do. We're going to move on. This one's a little bit weird. This was, by the way, this was a paragraph, it was a mini paragraph. Man and Nature challenged the popular belief that nature can heal any damage that people inflict upon it. Marsh argued that people may use and enjoy but not destroy the riches of earth. So because this is so short, I'm not really bothering to write down a whole note. I'm just underlining part of it. The part I decided to underline, well, there's two parts. The first part, challenge popular belief, goes back into a general theme that I'm noticing here, that Marsh and his ideas, that they weren't popular, that they were way before his time, and that people didn't really agree with him when it was written. It mentioned the first paragraph, and it's going to go into later how people started to agree with him long after he wrote his stuff, but it's important to underline challenge the popular belief because that's like a reoccurring thing here. The second part that I underlined was that people may use and enjoy but not destroy the riches of our earth. And the reason I would do that is I would underline it and then I'd put a little arrow that just said that is the main idea of Man and Nature. Man and Nature is clearly an important part of this passage, and that seems to be the general idea of what's it about. Okay, before we move on, I just want you guys to pause and think a little bit about why the author chose to break the structure of the passage and put a super short paragraph like this. We are doing function questions today, and in general, whenever you're reading a passage and the format changes a little bit, it's a good idea to just think in the back of your mind, like, why did they do that? What could the purpose be? I'm just putting that question out there. I'm not going to answer it, but if you have any ideas about it, write it down. It could come in handy later. Now we're going to move on. Furthermore, he asserted that everything in nature is significant and that even the tiniest organism affects the fragile environmental balance. His belief that drastic alteration of this balance would be dangerous is now accepted as a fundamental principle of modern environmental science. Next paragraph. Although he pointed out environmental damage is caused by irresponsible human activities, Marsh did not oppose every human alteration to the environment. To him, the goal was proper management, not a return to wilderness conditions. People should consider the consequences of their actions, he wrote, and become, quote, co-workers with nature, end quote. Marsh praised the Suez Canal, the human-made waterway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the greatest and most truly cosmopolitan physical improvement ever undertaken by man. He believed that the advantages of the canal, improved transportation and commerce, would outweigh any environmental damage. Yet he also warned of the possible unintended consequences, such as destructive plants and animals spreading from one body of water to another. Okay, I'm going to go to the underlining. I underlined in the first paragraph, fragile environmental balance, and in the second paragraph, the quote, co-workers with nature. So in general, quotes are important. When an author quotes someone, it's usually for a reason, usually because they want to really preserve the idea. So keep an eye out for quotes. I underlined those two because those two seem to be more of Marsh's really important ideas. The idea of a fragile environmental balance and the idea of co-workers with nature. That was a thing that he wanted. So now for the notes. For the first paragraph here, I wrote, some of GPM's ideas are now principles of modern science. I didn't specify which because this paragraph is pretty short. It doesn't go into detail about it, and because I underlined it. Fragile environmental balance is the idea that I'm talking about in my note. For the second paragraph, I wrote, GPM believed in building onto the environment without damaging it. Example, Suez Canal. So yeah, that pretty much explains the co-workers with nature quote, which by itself, I don't think I would have understood perfectly. And I add in the example of the Suez Canal because that is about half of the paragraph, so that's important. Okay, we're ending the passage. So Marsh was considered a radical thinker during his lifetime. By the late 19th century, however, his writings, along with those of John Muir and Henry David Thoreau and others, had inspired what became known as the conservation movement. The conservationists of that time sought to educate the public that wilderness areas were worth preserving and were responsible for creating the National Park Service and National Forest Service. Okay, so this is the last paragraph. I'm actually going to start with the notes and not the underlining for this one. So my notes, I wrote, GPM was considered radical, but his work later inspired the conservationist movement. The reason I did notes first is because what I underlined in this paragraph is these middle two sentences that kind of explain who the conservationists were and what their goals were, because I mentioned the conservationists in my little note, but I don't really explain what they do. Okay, so we're done the passage. That was the whole thing. Now we're going to move on to coming up with a main idea. And as I mentioned before, I know you guys remember how to do main ideas, but as I mentioned, those are really important to function questions because we're always trying to connect functions, like specific things back to the main idea and think about how they connect and why the author included it. So on the left side, I put all of my notes, and on the right side, I put most of the stuff I underlined. You probably already have this written down, but if you don't, pause the video and try to come up with one sentence for your main idea. It's probably going to be a bit of a longer sentence because you want to sum up the entire passage. I'm going to move on though. So my main idea was, George Perkins Marsh was a radical thinker who observed human impact on the environment long before the conservationist movement, which his writings are considered foundational to. So I know I used some slightly bigger words in my main idea than I did for the rest of my notes, but if you're writing your own main idea, which I encourage that you do, make sure that you have George Perkins Marsh, because that was the main part of this passage. He was the main guy. Make sure you have the fact that he observed, that he just studied humans and the environment, and the impact that his studies had, which is founding the conservationist movement and creating a generation of environmentalists. What I also want you guys to make sure that you have is either mention that he was radical or mention that his writings came long before the movement that they inspired, because that is really important. That's pretty heavily stressed. Okay, so you guys are done. Congratulations. We annotated some stuff and we did a pretty hard passage in my opinion. Now try the link in the description and do the questions. Once you're done, go see Alexa's video because she's going to go over them. I miss you guys a lot and thank you for watching. Bye.